Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me on this first lecture of our 8-week class. Hopefully, all of you have had an opportunity to take a look at the syllabus as well as the video that I put in the first area under modules under syllabus overview. If you haven't, please take a look at it. Some of you have actually already started to reach out via text message or phone calls. Um, so glad that you guys are actually, doing that. Great way to get in contact with me. But if you have had trouble getting in contact with me, feel free to just keep trying. I must admit I do work full time at Johns Hopkins, but teach as well. So if I don't answer immediately, it might just be because I'm in a meeting or working with some students. But yes, so glad that you're able to join. So this being our first lecture, as was talked about in the syllabus, as well as in the overview video, we are starting with the Reformation. And like in any history class, it's always good to just, know that, yes, prior to the Reformation, there were various events that contributed to the Reformation. And, likewise, that, trying to understand all of those nuances and aspects. But I always want to begin with, where exactly are we placing this? Like, what is our locale? What is the region that we're talking about and the time period? So when we are talking about the Protestant Reformation, or what is just often referred to as the Reformation, we are talking about Western Europe and we're talking about the 16th century. Okay. So are other things going on in the world? Absolutely. There's a whole bunch going on around the world. But for the purposes of, our course, we're going to start with this particular event, namely because of what it does in terms of establishing a new and profound way of thinking about the self and thinking about the individual, thinking about the idea of what it means to have freedom or self-determination, right? Prior to this period in the 16th century, it's not that people didn't have an awareness of themselves, right? But the idea of an individual being independent, right? The idea that an individual could determine one's outcome, that they had a role to play in this, and that it wasn't determined by an institution such as the Catholic Church or determined by an all-powerful God who could decide whether or not you lived or died, you got sick, you had this many children, you get married, right? All of these ideas, right? Because today, the way that we think about the individual and how we conceptualize our sense of self is very much influenced over the last 600 years of history, right? We take it for granted when we think about ourselves as just being an individual with self-determination and the ability to make choices, and how we can have a sense of perspective that can be pulled from multiple different ideas and ways of thinking and seeing the world. Well, if we take it back to the 16th century, that was just certainly not the case. And so what I want to do is I want to begin by, talking to you about this period in history and talking about this experience and whom exactly was a part of this radical change that would go on to contribute to other major changes, especially in the areas of individual freedom and of personal rights. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So the objectives for this lecture is that we're going to be looking at Europe before the Reformation. So we're looking at prior to about 1520. And we're going to be focusing on one particular individual by the name of Martin Luther. Um, Many of you may have, some sort of background or idea about Luther. Maybe some of you in this class have heard of Lutheranism, or are a follower of some of the teachings of the Lutheran doctrine. But we will be talking about this individual in terms of, not just who he was and his life and how it was very much representative of many people of the period. But also to see like how he really asserts this idea of self-determination and why exactly he is so beholden and willing to carry this out when everything that was going on at the time was, you know, influencing him to do otherwise. Okay. And then also we're going to look at the Reformation itself. What exactly, was this period in terms of the ideas that it was bringing forward? And then what exactly are these lasting impacts? Now, I'm not going to get into, all of the changes that started happening, across Western Europe, with the revolt against, Catholicism and the changing of, church doctrine, etc. We're not going to get into that because this isn't a, religious, historical course, but we will just look at what exactly allowed for some of those revolts to happen, some of those changes to take place. And we'll be looking at particularly with Martin Luther. Okay, so let's talk about Europe before the Reformation. All right. And there's two big areas that I really want to focus on: Catholic Church and the feudal system. Okay. And the main reason is the why we want to look at these two systems is that because these two systems, one which is an institution and a system, and the other one which is the economic, social, and political hierarchy of the period, were extremely determinative of a person's future, depending on where you were born, right, in Europe, to what social class you were born in. This had a very strong indication as to where exactly you were going to end up in the future. Okay. Maybe some of you have heard this sociological term. The class that you're born into is the one that you die into. Well, while today that has some sort of flexibility, right? There are people who do move into, higher income brackets as well as lower income brackets. During this period, before the Reformation, it was pretty much locked, right? If you're born into the peasant class, you're pretty much going to stay in the peasant class for the rest of your days. If you were born into, a noble family, chances are you're probably going to stay in that position. Maybe you could move up. If you're, destined to be, the king, maybe you're the son or the daughter of a monarch, your path was pretty much laid out before you. Okay. And so it's very important for us to understand how these two systems dominate daily life, right? Everything from your workday to what you wore, to how often you went to church, to what exactly whom you could marry, what you ate, everything was determined, right? These two systems gave you a specific track that you were to follow. And to step outside of that was not just physically dangerous, but it was seen as, almost heretical, that you were going against the very system, the church, that has been destined and created from God, right? You were going against the very will of God, that your life was determined because God has deemed it to be so. All right. And so these are the aspects that we're looking into, when we're talking about the life that Martin Luther is ultimately born into, institutions such as the Catholic Church and the feudal system. So let's get into the feudal system. Okay. To define it simply, right? If we really want to think about this, feudal system in terms of like, what exactly is this? What is feudalism? What is a feudal system, right? We are looking at a political, economic, and social system, right? Which blends local, regional, cultural, forms of regulation, like the traditions that are, authorities that regulate local people. And it is blended into this hierarchical system, right? Where you have an individual at the top and you have various individuals and so on and so forth, all the way to the bottom. As you can see here on this slide, we have various groups. King, obviously sitting up at the top. Below, the nobles. Then we have the high clergy, knights, burghers, low clergy, peasants, and the serfs. Okay. What is interesting to know about this is that while both systems, feudalism and the Catholic Church, dominated in terms of predetermining what people could do, what we want to try to understand here is what makes each of these groups different is the degree of freedom that each was able to enjoy. So clearly, if you were the king, the degrees of freedom are far greater than that of somebody who is a serf. Okay. And so this hierarchical structure, right, is what allows for the regulation and the governance of various areas and regions in Western Europe. Remember, prior to the development of feudalism and the system that Martin Luther is going to be born into, and that many people throughout Western Europe experience, roughly from about 600, 500, 600 AD, all the way up until this period. So we're talking about 1,000 years. This is because the prior system was that of Rome, right? Most of Western Europe is actually controlled by various prefects that are, in charge of regions that are descended in terms of the Roman Empire. Okay. Well, when Rome falls, right, you have the Vandals, you have the Goths, you have the Visigoths, right? You have all of this chaos that's going on. And so people begin to organize themselves in terms of protection, right? And so what you get is you get a hierarchical structure where you have an individual who is able to, through both physical power, money, and resources, able to dictate and regulate control over a certain region. But they have to have various people in order to enact that power. That's where you have nobles and high clergy, the knights, who is basically your military, burghers, and the low clergy, people who regulate local issues, and then the peasants and serfs who do all the work. Okay. So when we think about this, when you think about this system, you have like this hierarchical structure, you have land, which is basically the essence and the unit of everything, right? Land equals wealth. And if I have wealth, this is where I derive it from. Remember, everybody is working the land, right? Usually the serfs and the peasants, they earn their living from the land, whether that is through farming, hunting, whatever the case may be. But the person who actually owns all of this land, who controls all of this land, is the king, right? The person at the very top, right? Or it might be the church, right? Somebody is going to have definite dominion and control over that. And then it is other individuals such as nobles, knights, and burghers that are going to be able to maintain the control over that region and that sphere, right? And this is done through basically an agreement, what we call homage, right? An individual such as the king, who cannot be everywhere all at once, decides to create areas of fiefdoms, right? Land tracts that are then that are run by what a king would term or a queen would term their vassals, right? The people that serve them to protect that region and that area, basically a lord, right? Who is granted this this land to which they are able to work and reap the benefits. They pay a portion of whatever is earned from that land to the king in exchange for protection and money. Okay? Right? So if the king decides that, you know what, we're going to go and fight and try to get new lands, I need to call up your people, your knights, and yourselves to go and fight. This is how we're going to go and do it, right? So this is basically this agreement that happens. So is it an equal agreement? No, but there's benefits for both parties involved. But remember, that degree of freedom, as well as the degree of benefits, begins to decrease rapidly as you go down this hierarchical system, right? Serfs, for example, these are individuals who are tied directly to the land. Very little freedom. They're not going anywhere, right? They are basically tied because their homage is to the local individual whom they work for, whom they depend on for their very survival, not just their protection, right? But their ability in which to, garner resources so that they are able to manage and eke out an existence, right? And so when we look at this system, right, the keys to take away with the feudal system is that it is predetermined. Your position in life has already been decided. This is the system that you were born into. This is the system you're going to die into. You were born a serf, you're going to die a serf. You're born a part of the high clergy. Maybe you can move up and become a bishop. Maybe you'll get to go to Rome, right? But chances are you're probably going to hold that position, right? The reason why is because we have a system where this has all been decided, right? Feudalism is based off of this notion of divine kingship. right? That the king or that the or the the monarch, because there are queens as well. These monarchs serve because they have been chosen by God. Now, this is a new idea that comes about. It has basically been solidified by this time that we get to the 16th century. But this is a new idea that was really born out of the 8th century under a king by the name of Charlemagne in France, in the region what is known as France today. At the time, it was called Burgundy or Burgundy, right? And so, what you're looking at is that at the time when Charlemagne was trying to legitimate his position, right? What used to happen is that, a king would decide, and they basically, use their military prowess and basically, wheel and deal and take control over a various region, right? Well, that wasn't good enough for Charlemagne. He wanted to make sure that this was something that people could not just simply call into question. Well, the reason that you won is because you have more people, you have more resources. What Charlemagne wanted to do was he actually wanted to have it legitimated by another institution, that of the Christian church, the Catholic church, right? That is developed, that is developing. Remember, the Catholic Church is really at this period in the 8th century. We're talking about something that's roughly only about 300 years old, right? Not very, old here, right? We're still instituting ourselves, still coming up with all of these aspects. Remember, we're going to have this later problem, where we have the great schism that happens between, orthodoxy and the Catholic faith, right? You're going to have all these different aspects that are going to happen in the 13th century, right? But at the time in the 8th century, what Charlemagne wanted to do was he wanted to legitimate his position. And so he gets crowned by somebody of the church, a bishop, right? Or it might have been the Pope. Somebody do some checking on that to see if I'm correct. But the point is that to be crowned by somebody from the church means that this is an individual who is chosen, right? They're divine. God has sent this individual to you, right? And so this is where you get this idea of divine kingship, right? That it goes from God to the monarch to everybody else, right? And so this is a very interesting idea because even as late as the 20th century, you had people like Maria of Teck, the grandmother of the former Queen Elizabeth II. She was one of these people that, the purpose and the duty of monarchy, right, was to be something beyond that which most people could conceptualize, right? To allow the wretched, as she would call them, right? The ordinary people, something to strive for, right? These are not public servants, right? To be a king, to be a queen is not to be a public servant, right? You're not, elected, right? You are crowned, right? You are anointed, right? As the sovereign leader, right? So to be able to think about that idea of anointing, right? Not appointing, to be able to put you in a position like this, it is coming from God to the monarch, to this other area, to the rest of the people, right? And so this is the reason why the church becomes very, very integral to this system, right? Is that to call into question to call into question the king? Well, then you're calling the question of God. Heresy, right? You can't do that. And so this is what I want you guys to think about is how limiting that is, right? Because we have a structural system where your labor, where your predetermined outlook in life has already been decided. It doesn't matter what you dream of. It doesn't matter what you'd like to do. It's already been decided. Here it is. This is the system. And why is that? Because when we look at the system, of feudal society, notice who's at the top. King and the church, right? Now, many people would be like, well, isn't the king above the church? In many instances, just as today, the biggest owner of real estate in the world is still the Catholic Church, right? They've got more land than anybody else. So in terms of their influence, at the time in the 16th century, the church is extremely influential. Popes are able to, raise, hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? Popes can excommunicate, popes can decide, right? And so when we look at the role of the church and the king, right, they're pretty much on, footing that goes, back and forth, sort of like a scale. Like, are they ever equal? Sometimes there's a little bit more power on one side, less on the other, right? But it's not something to where you can clearly define one above the other, right? And so when you look at this system, notice, especially when we look at feudal society in the 16th century, things are beginning to change, right? Things are beginning to change, especially as somebody like Martin Luther, and when he is born into, at the end of the 15th century and, was growing up in the 16th century, things were changing. How were they changing? Well, there was a little bit more opportunity, right? For people not to be tied so physically tied to the land. They could actually, money was actually becoming more of an exchange to where people could have greater resources. There is a class of people, what you would call like the merchant class, that of people who had skills and abilities to where they could actually provide these services and earn money to where their children wouldn't necessarily have to do the exact same thing. So people who work in, smelting of iron or, copper, right? People who have a specialization, maybe somebody who makes boots or clothing, somebody who is a tailor, right? Somebody who is a butcher, right? Somebody who is a blacksmith, right? These were skills and abilities that were developing in these towns, craftsmen and merchants, to be able to allow them to be able to afford and make money so that their children don't necessarily have to follow in the same steps as they did in their parents' day or their grandparents' day, right? Where they were exactly tied to land. Farmer, 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 right? Serf, 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 right? Now there was this growing class, and this class of people is beginning to rival the nobles, right? In terms of influence, in terms of power, right? There's still the lords and the knights and the vassals, right? And there's still these people that wield enormous influence, right? But what we have is that we have a merchant class that is emerging at the end of the 15th century, particularly in areas of extreme uh, economic development, such as in trade, like in Venice, right? During the period of the Renaissance that's happening, right? Because remember, the Renaissance goes all the way from like roughly the 13th century all the way up to the 16th century. We're talking about a period of 300 years where there's a change in learning, change in trade, change in technology, right? There's all of these different changes, right? Remember, Renaissance means a rebirth. And so when we look at that, we want to really think like, okay, so this system in feudal society, it is locking people into a position, right? But what is most important for us to understand is that when there are these opportunities that begin to change, people's mindset changes, right? If I'm no longer tied, my child is no longer tied to becoming an iron ore smelter like me, but maybe I can afford to send them to school. Maybe can become a lawyer, right? Another profession that can maybe afford them a different experience. People begin to think differently about what's possible, right? Now, this isn't say, total free determined will, right? This is still very much based on the idea of what is possible. They're not saying like, well, I believe I could be the king. It's not that, right? Because, here, like in America, well, anybody could be president. As we can see, that's not always a good idea, right? Sometimes there need to be qualifications, not just dreams. But in any case, when we take a look at the feudal society, structured, hierarchical, few areas of flexibility. Okay. So let's look at the other system, the Catholic Church. Okay. By the end of the 15th century, we're talking, when we want to talk about institutions, right? So we have feudalism, definitely an institution that creates a hierarchical system of social, political, and economic performativity that is lockstep with European society, Western European society at the time. The Catholic Church is the other dominant way of governance, right? And the reason why that I want you to think about this is that because, for those of you who, may participate in religious practice, right? You know the traditions, you know the sayings, the stories, right? The expectations. Well, we have come to that point where there is a degree of free will, a decision that one can make to choose to participate, right? Well, at the end of the 15th century, there really is no choice, right? The Catholic Church is the only church in town, right? There is no other decision making. There is no body in which, people can choose to participate, right? We often take that for granted today. But at the end of the 15th century, we have an extensive network of churches that stretch the European continent. Ireland on one end, all the way up to the northern parts of, Sweden and Norway, all the way to the southern parts of Italy, right? Churches dominate, right? Catholic churches dominate this era. And this, like the system of feudalism that has the, rankings, so too it in the church. The Pope sits at the top, various cardinals, bishops, laity, priests, and so on, right? That govern this entire system of religious order throughout Western Europe. Okay. And so, as was shown in that previous image, the churches often rivaled those of kings and monarchs. Remember, they can often be determinative of who becomes the king, right? Who actually recognizes the power, right? And their presence in daily life cannot be overstated, right? Because what is so fascinating about the church is that the church was able to decide and legitimate various things that we have come to take for granted that we do ourselves, right? The church was the one that decided which births were legitimate, whose marriages were legitimate, whose wills were legitimate, whose property was legitimate, right? The story of creation. There's only one. There's only one, right? And it's told every single Sunday, right? Like these are the pillars of this institution. And so when we think about the ways in which the church is infused to everyday life, right? We think about, if for any of those of you who are Catholic, right? I was raised Catholic, so what was a part of everyday rituals in life was the seven sacraments, right? That there were seven aspects to your life that you had to experience in order to be considered, worthy of going to heaven, right? That an individual has to be able to do all these seven, right? And boy, was this drilled into me as a young kid, right? That this is how you're going to do it, right? Immortal sin, absolutely. You're going to burn in hell. I mean, imagine that for a 5-year-old to be told that, right? But you have to think about how the presence of the church is all encompassing, right? So you have a system, an economic and political system that governs your labor, your performance, and then you have a religious institution that governs your thoughts. Okay? One that governs your physical labor, your behaviors, your performances, and the other one that governs your thoughts, right? Because it tells you how you are to behave, what you are supposed to do, whom you're supposed to obey, right? It is the church authority. Comes from God to the Pope, and then it is ascended to you, right? The ability to turn, to have and consume the body and blood of Christ, right? This is the divine. And so these ideas are imbued to the everyday aspect. And so this is totalizing. There is no other story in town. This is it, right? And so, yes, you may dream or think about something else, but how can you when this is the ways in which we think and talk and engage and create the rhythms of our experience? You're right. Church feast days, births, weddings, celebrations, wars, plagues, right? Economic booms, economic collapse, right? Whatever the case may be. The church is there. The feudal system is there. Okay. And so this, my friends, is the world in which Martin Luther was born into. Okay. Now, is Martin Luther born poor? No, actually, his father is a member of the growing craftsman merchant class, right? They're not balling out of control. They have a house, right? They have opportunities. They have resources, right? They are a family that is what you would consider up and coming, right? Mobile, right? Socially mobile, right? People. But it is to be clear, Martin Luther was not born into a family that was, it wasn't all roses and chocolate and love and, hugs and kisses. Um, Father was, extremely strict. Mother was even stricter, right? We're talking, beatings that were regular. We're talking about punishments that were regular. Luther is somebody who's brought up in the church. He actually participates as, an altar boy, participates in the rituals, the Sunday masses, right? This is regular. This is regular, right? And, because his father, is, works in the copper mines, copper ore and smelting, very, very lucrative at the time, he's able to save some money and he's able to send Luther to school, right? So he goes to school in Mansfeld and then he attends school in Magdeburg and then Eisenach, and then he finally enters the university at Erfurt, where his father wanted him to become a lawyer, right? Studies very hard, has these experiences, but it's to be clear, Erfurt as a university town, right? Essentially, right? We've heard of these as college towns, right? If you've ever been to a college town, so I'm thinking like, oh, Ohio State, University of Virginia, University of Texas, Austin, right? Actually, Austin's not really a college town, but there's a college district, okay? So, but in any college town, what do you have? You have an area down there, or Athens, Georgia, where the University of Georgia is. That's a college town, people. Okay. Or where I used to teach at the University of South Carolina. Columbia has a college town. It's called Five Points, right? It's where all the young people go to enjoy themselves on, Thursday through Sunday night, before dragging themselves back to classes if they can make it. Okay. But what is characteristic of Erfurt at the time is two things that Martin Luther really learns and develops, is that he has an opportunity in which to engage, socially with other people and other, students, right? Usually over, some good ale, right? There was plenty of bars in Erfurt at the time. And, he has the opportunity to build some camaraderie, to build relationships, to build friendships, right? And what's really interesting is that he gets an MA, he gets a master's, right? And he's about to finish law. Um, but then something happens, right? He's on his way home, to go visit his family, as the story goes. And he is caught in a terrible, terrible thunderstorm, right? We're talking, he gets thrown off this horse and, he's near, there's no shelter, because he's out basically in, the countryside. And it's at this moment that he, as the story goes, that he prays to God for, divine intervention, that, should he, be able to make it through the night, should he be saved, should he be chosen, right? He would devote himself to a religious order, right? And so miraculously he's saved. And so then he tells his father, well, I'm not going to finish the last two classes because I think it was literally only two more classes that he needed. To finish his degree, his law degree, and he decides to become a hermit. But he doesn't just go with any sort of group of hermits. He decides to go and become a monk with the Augustinians. And this is kind of important because the Augustinians were a order that was probably like the most challenging of all orders. Like this is a group that, where you are going to be putting yourself physically and mentally through such challenge, suffering, I think would actually be, a good word to use here, to be able to try to open oneself up to the divine, right? To be able to come to a greater sense of awareness, right? of, superb and utter understanding of, you know, God and the experience. Okay. And so, he doesn't just join any old group, right? This is one of the more challenging ones. So, as a monk, right? And I'm not sure if any of you, really know about this system, but what Luther decides to sign himself up for is a church system and a church lifestyle where he goes from, university life, having conversations over, ale and, cavorting with women and, enjoying, college life essentially to one of, strict and limited, protocol, right? His entire day as a monk, as it was for monks of that period, as it is to this very day, it is centered around the liturgical day, right? Which means that every 7 hours, essentially, monks were expected to be present in a um, in a performative duty, usually a singing and a prayer for mass, right? So we're talking every 7 hours. Okay, so if you think about that, that means that even at midnight, or sometime at maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, right? Luther and his other fellow monks are there, right? Praying. And so what this means is that these rigid experiences, right? This idea to be able to choose what you want to do throughout the day, gone, right? Privacy is gone. Free time is gone. He has spent his time reading, reflecting, praying, right? All of the things that were necessary to be able to achieve a sense of salvation, right? The idea of the Augustinian monks, in particular, was that one needed to remove all of the comforts, right, of this world in order to be able to open up one's soul to the divine, right? So your clothes are uncomfortable. The food is bland, right? Everything is very, very circumscribed. It is very, very plain, very, very simple. But what's fascinating about it is that Luther thrives in this, right? His sense of routine, his duty, he throws himself into this, into study. And it is a fascinating time for Luther because Luther really feels that, this is an opportunity for me to figure out, what exactly I can do and how I can be able to figure out what exactly is that path to God, right? Now, given the fact that, Luther was continually going through, these periods of intense suffering, he even, put it on himself. There's a wonderful story where, he is in such a period of deep, deep reflection that he would sit out in the snow, right, without anything on, and it would take other monks to bring him inside, right? Because he is in such a point of physical, manifestation of the spiritual and of this suffering to be able to open himself up to total salvation, right? Some people would say that, this is absolutely insane. Why would you do this? Why would you put yourself in such a position? But for Luther, it was very necessary to be able to go through these routines and to be able to divorce oneself of that comfort, right? To be able to present oneself with this ability to be able to achieve it. Now, what's interesting about this time as a monk, Luther is given an opportunity, once in a lifetime opportunity, in which to go to Rome. He is sent on a pilgrimage by his order to go to Rome. Now, Rome at the time in the 16th century is the center of all of Catholic life, right? This is the pinnacle, right? And he is going to get this opportunity in which to be around other scholars. He's able to do mass, right? He's able to, experience this, and he's hoping that such an experience is going to be able to bring him closer to try to understand how does one reach that salvation, right? Unfortunately, um, he's very disappointed. So when he gets there, because what he realizes is that rather than Rome being a spiritual center, he finds that it is nothing but a large business, right? A business of manufacturing and producing and performing these rituals just so that one can acquire greater position in the church, one can acquire more money, one can acquire more things and goods and everything else. There is an interesting story that he is performing mass at one point, and one of the other priests, is near him at the front, and he's going through this position of the prayer and beginning the service, and one of the priests that's there, sort of like moans and goes like, "Oh, just get on with it." Right? Well, for Luther, this is sacred, right? This is the divine. These ideas of performing the mass is to recreate that meal, right? Of that Last Supper where Jesus decides that, his body is going to be given up for the covenant, for this relationship between all of mankind and God, right? And he thinks this is very serious. He's like, this is important. And here we have this priest like, come on. Can't we just move on, right? Another story, he is saying, the body and blood of Christ. And there's another priest who, is basically like, yep, bread and wine, it's not the body and the blood, it's just bread and wine, and that's what it's going to stay, right? Like all of these things. He's realizing that these people aren't committed, that they don't really believe in this, that this is just all about position and money and power, right? He goes to the catacombs that are in Rome. Many of them you can still see to this day, to try to look at the saints, right? These people who sacrifice themselves for the word, for the spiritual advancement, for, the divine, right? And in order to get into the catacombs, he has to pay, right? This isn't open to just be anybody else. People have to pay for it, right? But above all, the one thing that would continue to irk Luther at this time and then later in his life is the role of indulgences, right? And I almost forgot. During these little yellow areas, you can click on them and they'll actually take you to a new link, that'll give you another video. You can click on, the indulgences and you can look at an example here. So I just, want you guys to be able to see that. That's the reason why it's yellow. It's highlighted. It'll take you to a link, something else. But indulgences, yes. So what is an indulgence? An indulgence is basically a written document, right? Printed document where it allows the bearer, right, a person, to be able to gain access to salvation, right? To get into heaven, right? And these indulgences, very profitable, right? Comes from God to the Pope to the indulgence. If I have an indulgence in my hand, all those sins that I did and that bad works that I did, or how I treated my neighbor, or if I did this to my wife, right? I've got an indulgence. I'm good. I'm going to go into heaven. This absolutely irks Martin Luther. He's totally frustrated by this, right? And he's frustrated by it because he's like, no, that's not the way to do it. You can't just write on a piece of paper and say I'm in heaven. He was like, it's a process. The way you reach salvation is through a process of study, of reflection, of changing your mindset, of changing your behaviors, of doing right, of following the teachings. And so this is what ultimately leads Luther to realize that the church itself, rather than being this entity that is trying to save mankind, is really just a business. And they're just trying to make money off of people. This really irked Luther, okay? And what ends up happening is that when he returns back to Wittenberg, where he basically becomes depressed for a while because after what he experienced in Rome, he's like, he loses his sense of direction and purpose, right? Well, he is befriended by another monk, and this individual who is basically over him, somebody who's higher up in the authority here, decides that, we're going to give you a position. You seem to be spending far too much time in your head and these deep reflections, and you're in the snow and all this other stuff. So I got to give you something to do. So he decides, he says, you know what you're going to start doing? You are going to start teaching students about the Bible. This is what you're going to do, okay? Because I got to get you out of your head. And maybe if I put you in charge of other people, maybe this will get you into a better position. So Luther begrudgingly decides to do this, but he actually flourishes. He flourishes in this opportunity. He learns how to read Greek. He learns how to read Aramaic. He learns, he's already schooled in reading Latin. And so he can begin to read the original texts, right? That many of the founders and the people who had existed during the second, third, and fourth centuries, what the languages they were writing, the original stories about Jesus and the original ideas of formulating the church, right? He doesn't have to trust somebody else. He can go to it himself. And so now he's not only just in charge of learning this information, because with all things Luther, he wanted to be really good at what he did. He didn't just, do it second, second best. He was like, I'm going to excel at this. So he dedicates himself to study so that he can be the best professor that he can. And in this process of reading the texts in both Aramaic and in Latin and in Greek, he comes to this realization that there is something beyond, that it is not the role of an institution to help you reach God's salvation. God's salvation for Luther was already there. You just simply had to enter into that and want to be determined to reach it with God, right? You don't need an intermediary. You don't need a priest or a bishop or a pope to tell you that. God's forgiveness, God's grace, God's salvation exists for all those out there. You simply have to be willing to work towards that salvation. You do not need an indulgence to get you there. You do not need the good praise or the decision-making of a hierarchical church. You can have this decision yourself. Now, this is why this is so radical, people. Okay, because you are going against an entire business. The entire business of the Catholic Church is the legitimization that their position is determined and defined by God. And for the last 1,000 years, this has been the only story in town. And so here comes this little grubby monk from Wittenberg in Germany to say, well, actually, God's grace is available for anyone. And all one has to do is just be available for it. And where this comes is in his 95 Theses. You've heard about Martin Luther taking it and, nailing it to the door, of the Wittenberg Church, right? And so, you can actually take a look at the Theses here if you want to take a look. But what they are is they're basically in the language that that Luther is using at the time, is that this was not meant to be a standoffish aspect, right? He thought that this was going to create more discussion, right? That there was going to be more talk about this amongst his other fellow laity, that maybe we can discuss like, well, there's a problem with these aspects, right? I mean, like if you look at number 7, for instance, God remits guilt to no one unless at the same time he humbles him in all things and makes him submissive to the vicar and the priest, right? It's like, well, wait a second. It's like guilt to no one unless at the same time he humbles him in the things that he makes him submissive to the priest and the vicar, right? What's happening there is that you're already seeing in number 7, like, right, is that you don't need the vicar or the priest. You can submit yourself to God, right? But we're told that in order to submit to God, you must first submit to these individuals, to the structure and the laity. What the 95 Theses do is calls that into question, right? The legitimation of this. Like, this is very similar. You're talking about upending an entire system to which determines, governance, structure, order, right? This is very similar to what was happening in the, in Egypt under King Amenhotep, right? When he decides that, There's not multiple gods. There's only one God, Ra, the sun. That's all we're going to do, right? We're just going to deal with one, right? Well, you're putting a lot of people out of business here, Amenhotep. You can't just do that. I'm the priest for the water. This is the priest for the air, the priest for the land, the priest for this, right? And you're just saying now it's just one, the sun? Holy crap, you are putting people out of work here, my man. You're going to piss off a lot of people. Same thing here, right? These 95 theses begin to create some trouble, right? Now, Luther hadn't intended this at all. He wasn't intending this to be a big issue, right? He was like, well, somebody will read it. We'll have some conversations. We'll, come to some ideas. I'll be able to talk about it and we'll go from there. However, what Luther didn't anticipate was the fact that people were going to actually reprint this, that people were going to get a hold of the 95 Theses and actually circulate it around. Why is this an issue? Well, 50 years earlier, another German by the name of Gutenberg creates and perfects the printing press, meaning that mass production of the written word no longer had to be determined by people who were simply writing things out, right, by hand and copying them down and writing them out, right, which took years, now could be produced literally in hours or days, right? And we can mass produce it. These 95 theses, which are produced and reproduced and printed all over the place and make their way all the way to Rome, right, begin to create some troubles. Now, why is that? Well, there's a couple of factors that go into it. So, people are already starting to question this idea of the legitimation of the church, right? The only story in town, right? It's like, well, wait a second. Why exactly is it that I have to pay these tithes? I have to show up every Sunday. Why is it that I have to only believe and listen to this one story, right? Why is it that everything that I'm told that I have to do, that I am not allowed to be able to consider something else, right? And so what is important about this is that Luther begins to chip away at that, right? He begins to say like, no. All one has to do is be open to this idea that achieving salvation doesn't come from the legitimation of the Pope or the laity. It's between you and God. Why is that so radical? Well, it's radical because what it does is it puts this idea of self-determination at the forefront, that you can determine your relationship and your salvation on your own. It's up to you, not a priest, not the Pope, not an indulgence. It's up to you. So people are now in this initial stages of this aspect beginning to think about, wait a second. So I have a part in determining my experience, right? This isn't full-on, full-blown independence, people. Don't get it thinking like that. But it is a beginning way of thinking about how the individual does have a role. Because prior to that, remember, the individual has no role. It's already been determined. God has decided your role. The church is going to reinforce it with its teachings. That is your role. Luther says, no. There is a relationship and there is salvation to be achieved. You can achieve it if you decide to. You have a role to play. So we begin this idea of choice, right? We begin to chip away at this idea of freedom of choice, right? And so, of course, automatically what happens is that Luther is going to be labeled a heretic, right? He's excommunicated, right? And of course, Luther is like, please excommunicate me, whatever. You're not even worthy of that, right? And Luther just has a field day with any sort of priest or laity that tries to come at him to tell him that he's wrong. He's like, these people aren't even worthy. They haven't studied. They haven't done anything. Does Luther have a little bit of arrogance? Sure he does, but he's backed himself up because he puts himself in this position to be able to critique these aspects, right? You've heard of, probably the most important place where Luther has this opportunity in which to bring his ideas forward beyond the classroom, beyond, Wittenberg, is at the Diet of Worms, right? A diet is a gathering of all of the big hobnobs of the church and of the nobility, right? They meet once a year, and Luther's invited to speak, right? And he gives this incredible discussion about how you can discover this process of God, right? Because when he goes to the Diet of Worms, right, he makes this incredible statement that here I stand, I can do no other. God help me, amen. I have this ability to be able to question and to ask, if I have done everything that I can, if I am the one that is able to do this, who else is able to determine that for me? Why is my position as somebody who has sacrificed and studied and worked, right? Why is it that this is not good enough? Because remember, Luther doesn't just stop at the Diet of Worms. He is writing and writing and writing, and his writings get picked up and they get published and they get sent all over Europe, right? There is a fascinating work that he writes. It's called On the Babylonian Captivity of the Church. This gets circulated. And why that's crucial to know is that because Babylon, in terms of the way that he's framing it, Babylon is seen as the city of sin in the Bible, right? And so what his argument is that he says the church has been corrupted, that the church is corrupting us and is literally putting us all into danger because they are denying us the true salvation with their corruption of indulgences, with their corruption of this church, with this greed, right? And so by criticizing these aspects, he calls into this question, especially the sacraments. Remember, I mentioned the 7. He says that there's only 2, right? And that you don't need to do all 7 to get closer to God. All you need to do is have that relationship of the self with God. Okay? What's fascinating about this is that he's supposed to get this verdict at the Diet of Worms, and the judges can't come up with a unanimous verdict, right? And so what ends up happening is that he's free to go. He basically gets kidnapped by one of these other dukes who's basically a friend of his and puts him into hiding in Germany, where the Pope and his people can't touch him, because if they did, they would have not only arrested him, they would have burned him at the stake as a heretic, right? So he goes on and lives in his life as, as a hermit, doesn't get to teach anymore. But what is most important to know about is his ideas, right? Is that one of the things that Luther does that's extremely powerful is that he pushes beyond this and he fights back. His writings demonstrate that. His speech at the Diet of Worms, shows that. His, on the Babylonian captivity of the church demonstrates that. And all of these writings that continue to spread, people begin to question them, right? They begin to question this idea of how can just one authority determine all, right? Isn't it a possibility that I can have some sort of role in that? And when you chip away at that, mystique, right, of that all-encompassing, all-powerful, all-knowing, what Luther begins to do is he shifts that power to the individual, right? It opens up a little space where individuals are able to think about this, that maybe my relationship is something that I have a say over. And so what's really interesting is that what Luther is ultimately discussing is this idea of the freedom to believe, right? To believe in a way that is not an authority to anyone else. And he has that great quote right there at the bottom, I have the right to believe freely, to be a slave to no man's authority, to confess what appears to me to be true, whether it is proved or disproved. Nobody was thinking like that in the 13th century, right? Right? This is really why the Reformation and the events that happen afterwards, going forward, which will eventually, we'll see scientific revolution, enlightenment, the idea of divine governance, divine kingship, right? All of these notions begin to be changing, because what is developing in this moment is the foundations that we would eventually call the individual, right? Luther is recognizing that an individual has the right to believe in something without the determinations of an authority. But the true authority is there for me to be able to grasp. And so if I have the ability to grasp that authority, then certainly I can grasp other concepts and ideas and authorities and be able to do this. Okay. So that's where we get it. Pretty cool stuff, right? Okay. So take a look at that. Look forward to the next one. If you have any next lecture, if you have any questions or anything like that, feel free to reach out to me via text or email. I look forward to it.